I'm going to give you a recap on Mental Capacity Act and in particular on capacity, then look at fluctuating capacity in the case of CDM, which is the case that I've been involved in and is currently adjourned in the Court of Appeal, and then look at the exercise of capacity and the recent case of Myers. That's another case I was involved in, which is a case under the inherent jurisdiction, just make sure that you know about that and the difficulties that arise as a result of that case. Clicking on to the next slide now. Right, so just recapping then on the Mental Capacity Act and capacity. So the test for capacity is set out in section 2, and it's worth reminding ourselves of what it actually means when we stand back and say somebody lacks capacity to make a decision. Because what they have to be unable to make the decision for themselves. Okay, so that's the big picture. Are they unable to make the decision? That is assessed via section 3, and I'll come on to that. But the first point is, are they unable to make a decision, and is that because of an impairment or disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain? Okay, so there has to be a causal connection between their inability to make the decision and their impairment. And their impairment must be an impairment in the disturbance of the functioning of the mind or brain. So we all come across people who are unable to make decisions because of the fact that they're alcoholics or they're drug addicts. That is not sufficient under the Mental Capacity Act, because an addiction to substance abuse is not an impairment in the disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain, unless the substance abuse has become so pronounced that it actually caused structural change to the brain, like Korsakoff syndrome or something like that. So that's where you pick up, if you like, the disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain, and it's got to be causatively linked. I'm going on now to the next slide. So how do we assess whether somebody is unable to make a decision for themselves? Well, we're all familiar with the test in section 3. The person has to be unable to understand the information relevant to the decision and to retain that information, to use or weigh that information, and to communicate that information. So the first thing that one has to do is to identify, and I'm now going on to the next slide, is to identify what the decision is. That sounds straightforward, but in the case of CDM, in a subsequent High Court hearing, there was a long debate about what diabetes management involves. Does it involve, are you assessing each individual decision, i.e. does somebody have the capacity to monitor their blood glucose? Do they have the capacity to make decisions about what they eat? Do they have the capacity to administer their insulin, etc.? Or are you looking at diabetes management as one matter? Do they need to be able to have capacity to make all of those decisions in order to be treated as somebody who has capacity to manage their diabetes? It's not always straightforward identifying what the particular decision is. Once you've done that, what's the relevant information? Again, not always straightforward. We know from the Act that it includes the reasonably foreseeable consequence of deciding one way or another, or failing to make a decision. So that's of some help. And we know from the case of CC and KK, which is a welfare case of Mr. Justice Baker, as he was then, that P must have the potential options provided to him or her before one can assess whether or not they understand, retain, use or weigh the relevant information. That was a case some of you may remember about whether an elderly lady who was deprived of her liberty in a care home had the capacity to make decisions about where she lived and what care she required. And the local authority was criticised because they had assessed her capacity in a vacuum, i.e. they hadn't properly identified what care package would be in place if she were to return home. So, you know, what support would she have? How would she be able to summon her help, etc.? And so the court said, well, you can't, your capacity assessment is not worth anything, because she needs to have been told, this is what you will have. That explanation needs to be given to her, and then you need to assess her ability to understand, etc., against that information. So, assessing whether somebody understands information is, in a sense, more straightforward, because you are faced with somebody in front of you and you are able to assess whether in that moment they can understand the information that you're giving them. It becomes more difficult when you are assessing whether somebody can use or weigh information, because very often the person won't be making the decision right there in front of you. So in a sense, what you're looking at is you're looking at evidence about how they have used or weighed information in the past. And very often that will only come from the outcome of the decision. Did they make a sensible decision, or did they make an unwise decision, wise or unwise? And you're crystal ball gazing to a certain extent. Do you think they are going to be able to manipulate the relevant information in the future? Are they going to be able to use or weigh it? And what you're trying to analyse there is the process that the person goes through with the relevant information. So that is often where capacity assessments become more complex. And what you need to do is identify where P falls down, as I put on the slide, but where is the deficit? What is it? Why is it that you say that P cannot use or weigh or understand the information? Next slide. So we've got to remember that there is a presumption of capacity. So again, it's for the assessor to identify where the deficit is. You start with the assumption that everybody is able to do all of these things, and you have to evidence why you say a person cannot do it. And this is really important, the second bullet point. The assessment is not concerned, assessing somebody's capacity is not concerned with the outcome of the decision that they make, okay? So, somebody may make consistently unwise decisions, but that does not mean that there is a deficit in their ability to understand, etc. As long as they are able to understand all the relevant information and use or weigh it, it doesn't matter whether they give no weight to a particular factor that 99.9% of the population would put at the top of the list for most important factors. So, for example, wanting to stay alive, if you're talking about medical treatment. As long as the person understands that if they don't take the treatment, they will not stay alive, it doesn't matter if they give no weight to it. So, but of course, often it is the fact that somebody is making unwise decisions that prompts a capacity. There's nothing wrong with that, that's human nature. We don't tend to go around assessing people's capacity if they seem to be making decisions that we find sensible and acceptable. It's often when somebody starts making unwise decisions that prompts a capacity assessment. Nothing wrong with that, but that, as we know, is not sufficient to establish that somebody does not have capacity. Okay, I'm going on to the next slide now, which is entitled Fluctuating Capacity. So this is when it gets really tricky. And it gets really tricky because it is really tricky, but it also gets really tricky because the Mental Capacity Act isn't really set up to deal with fluctuating capacity. So it's helpful to look at the circumstances in which capacity fluctuates. And when I was preparing with Alex Rupp-Keene, who some of you may know, when we were preparing for the Court of Appeal, we found it helpful to identify the sort of cohorts of Ps whose capacity would fluctuate. And we identified 3 different cohorts, and it becomes progressively more difficult to deal with them as we go through the groups. So the first cohort, and the one that the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice does actually refer to, are those people whose capacity fluctuates for a definable and understandable reason. So, for example, an elderly person gets a UTI, they start hallucinating and so on, they need antibiotics, take antibiotics, UTI goes, and the confusion, etc., disappears. Or within that cohort as well, somebody has a significant mental illness, which if they take their medication, goes into remission such that they then are able to make decisions for themselves. They then stop taking their medication, they become floridly unwell again, and they lack capacity. So the Code of Practice deals with that cohort of people, and what it says is, if you can put off the decision, put it off until they've regained their capacity, and when it comes to going to the court for that cohort, we tend to deal with it by saying, well, at the moment they lack capacity, so the court has jurisdiction to make decisions in relation to them, so we make section 48, interim declarations. The court becomes the decision maker for them. They then regain capacity, and the declarations are discharged. Proceedings come to an end because the court no longer has jurisdiction. That's fairly straightforward. The thing that's difficult is working out where on the capacity barometer that the person is at any particular time. Then you have a cohort of people whose capacity fluctuates more frequently, but on a predictable basis. So in that cohort, we identified, for example, those dementia patients who are able to make decisions in the morning, but by the evening have become more confused and are unable to make decisions. So they are simpler to deal with because you can identify predictably when they are going to have or lack capacity. It's either going to be as a result of the time of day. Sometimes it may be an environmental stimulus. Somebody is able to make decisions in some environments, but not in others. But you can predict where they will be, again, on the capacity barometer, lacking or having, depending on the circumstances in which they're in. And so you can plan for their care and how decisions are going to be made in that knowledge. The really difficult cohort are the last cohort, where people's capacity fluctuates on an unpredictable basis. And in that cohort, we put our case of CDM. So CDM is a lady who has, I think, at the last count, 5 personality disorders. And she is able to sit down and have a discussion with you sometimes about really quite complex things. So she can take on board very difficult information and interrelate it to other information. And sometimes she talks absolute nonsense, if I can put it like that, without being disrespectful, makes no sense at all, and is clearly not able to take on board any information at all. And it's, according to all the experts that have assessed her, impossible to predict when she will be able to have a conversation with you and when she won't. And we also put into that cohort those with acquired brain injuries. And we looked at some of the research in relation to that cohort piece, and there seemed to be a difference between assessing somebody's decision with an acquired brain injury in an assessment situation where they were able to have a discussion and use and weigh information, and then watching some making decisions in what I've called on the slide real time, or sometimes it's called online decisions, online real-time decision making, or online decision making, and the difference between the way they say they will, the decisions they say they will make when they're being assessed, and they're able to weigh it up in the sort of calm environment, and the what are often unwise online or real life real-time decisions that are made often in quite heated circumstances where it seems that they are not able to use or weigh information. And again, difficult to predict where somebody is going to be, and really difficult because is it simply that they have the ability, the capability of using and weighing information, but just are not in the moment? Does that mean you lack capacity? Or are they actually able to do that in the moment, but are just making unwise decisions, which of course we are all entitled to do. So I'm going on to the next slide now, fluctuating capacity continued. That's the title of the slide. So if capacity fluctuates and it's a one-off decision that needs to be made, can we put the decision off until the person has capacity? That's the obvious first question, and that works really well with the first group I talked about, and it can work really well with the second group as well, depending on what the decision is. Very difficult, the third group. If you're looking after someone that has fluctuating capacity, consider getting them to do an advanced statement about how they wish to be treated at times when they lack capacity, and then you can deliver their care in accordance with that. And of course, if it's a decision to refuse treatment, then they can make a legally binding advance decision under Section 23 of the Mental Capacity Act. And so then that can be, one can treat them in accordance with that. So I'm now going on to the next slide, which is when fluctuating capacity continued, which deals with continuing decisions. So it's less clear to work out how you deal with somebody who needs to make ongoing decisions or continuing decisions. The decisions about personal care, decisions about, in the case of CDM, diabetes management. A number of decisions need to be made frequently through the day, through the weeks, etc. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about defining the matter that is being assessed, but do you take a broad view of what the material time is that the person needs to have capacity for? Going back to the test under Section 2, the question is whether or not somebody has capacity to make a decision at the material time. So what does that mean? Does it mean, as the experts said in CDM, the diabetes management, it's a lifelong condition, therefore the material time is the whole of your life, which was a slightly startling proposition, but nevertheless, is that the material time? Or is it a different time for ongoing decisions? Is it when the actual decision needs to be made, even if it needs to be made frequently during the day? So that obviously gives rise to huge practical issues. If the material time is this broad over a long period of time, then probably the obligation is to assess a person's capacity in a wide sense. It'll be a wider, broader assessment of all of the elements of the decision, but it will be, if one, depending on the nature of the P, but for example, if one assesses them on day one and says lacks capacity, perhaps you would have an obligation to assess them, I don't know, 3 months later to see whether anything has changed, to see whether the balance has changed, and so on. Or are you assessing the person every time you approach them to offer them care and saying, well, am I delivering this care to this person as somebody who has capacity, in which case they can refuse or accept it and I stand by their decision, or am I delivering this care to this person on the basis that they lack capacity and I'm making a best interest decision for them? And if it's the latter, then you will probably want to, well, in fact, in either circumstance, depending on the nature of the care that's being delivered, you may feel that you need to record your decision so that you can justify it at some later time. So I'm now going on to the next slide, which is CDM. It says rather oddly CDM continued, but this is the first CDM slide. I set out here why the question of her capacity is important. So she has very unstable diabetes, is very uncooperative with care, needs lots and lots of discussion and bargaining in order to receive insulin or have her bloods tested, and while living at home was in a diabetic coma on several occasions, found in a diabetic coma on several occasions. So the risks to her life of non-cooperation and non-compliance with diabetes management are serious. And it's difficult for those on the ground because she often refuses treatment. So should they allow her to refuse treatment on the basis that she has capacity with the risk that she may die if nothing is done about that? Or should they be forcing treatment on her on the basis that she lacks capacity and it's in her best interest and it will save her life? And if they're wrong about that, that would amount to an assault. So the stakes are really high on the facts of that particular case. It is a real difficulty for those on the ground dealing with CDM. So I'm going on to the next slide now, and this is just emphasising and taking further the risks of acting on either basis. So the risk of proceeding on the basis that CDM lacks capacity is a risk to her autonomy, i.e. you override her autonomous right to either accept or refuse treatment, but her risk in requiring professionals to assess her multiple times a day is to the stress on the care package and burdening her with decisions which cause her to become emotionally dysregulated and lose capacity. So the evidence was when you burden her with decision making, actually that is not maximising her capacity. To maximise her capacity, she needs strict boundaries and a framework within which care is delivered. Until you know the basis upon which that care is being delivered, it makes it very difficult. The position in relation to CDM is that the case has gone to the Court of Appeal on whether or not Section 15 of the Mental Capacity Act, which is the act the part of the act which makes declarations about capacity, whether or not you can have a declaration under Section 15 which says somebody's capacity fluctuates, or whether you have to have a declaration that says somebody either has or lacks capacity, with a judgment setting out the circumstances in which somebody will have or lose capacity. But of course, in the case of CDM, that's very difficult because it's impossible to predict when she will or won't have capacity. That's been adjourned at the moment, and the matter's now being, and whether or not that will go, whether or not that appeal will reignite at some later stage, I don't know, because there's been a further judgment and further evidence and so on. So that's all being considered at the moment. So that's some of the difficulties around inherent jurisdiction. Around fluctuating. I want to deal before I finish at 10:45, just briefly with the inherent jurisdiction, because that has the case of Myers has meant that, which was only decided in February, I've had a lot more inquiries about inherent jurisdiction across my desk because it has rather expanded the circumstances in which local authorities need to be considering whether or not, even if someone has capacity, they should be approaching the court to get protective orders to require somebody to live somewhere or receive care, etc. So just reminding you what that is. It's a flexible remedy. It can only be exercised by the High Court, so you can't grant yourself any remedy under the inherent jurisdiction. It involves issuing High Court proceedings and getting orders from the High Court. And it's there to protect and oversee the welfare of those under a disability that the courts have a duty to protect, and it's part of the common law. It's called the Great Safety Net, and it fills gaps where it's necessary to do so. So before the Mental Capacity Act came in, all the decisions around capacity and best interest were under the court's inherent jurisdiction. The Mental Capacity Act came in, and there'd been a spate of cases subsequent to that, which has established that the inherent jurisdiction survives the Mental Capacity Act, and it's there effectively to fill in the gaps where the Mental Capacity Act doesn't act. So, for example, if it's being used where somebody lacks capacity within the meaning of the Mental Capacity Act, but for some reason you can't provide a remedy under the Mental Capacity Act, either because somebody's outside the jurisdiction, there's one case, or because they're ineligible to be deprived of their liberty, for example, then the inherent jurisdiction can come in to fill the gap, to provide that protection so that there's no lacuna in the law. What we're talking about here is the inherent jurisdictions, the use of the inherent jurisdiction to protect competent but vulnerable adults. So immediately you're getting into difficulties because these are competent adults. They have capacity within the meaning of the Mental Capacity Act. They have autonomy. They are vulnerable, so one has to establish vulnerability. And then one has to say, well, certainly the case law at the moment says, if you're competent but vulnerable, but you are unable to exercise your capacity because of constraint, coercion or undue influence, so i.e. action of another, or for some other reason, and that's where we come to Myers, the person is deprived of being able to make the relevant decision. They are disabled from making a free choice or giving or expressing a real and genuine consent. That's an old decision of Mr. Justice Mumby, as he then was, and it's still the leading case. So if you have capacity and you're vulnerable, but you are constrained, you are unable to exercise your capacity to wish for some reason, then the inherent jurisdiction can be exercised in relation to you. So this was the situation in Myers was this. Mr. Myers is a 98-year-old man. He is blind, he is diabetic, and he has limited mobility. Lived at home with his drug-addicted son, who destroyed his home and was abusive to carers. No care agency would go in to deliver care, and the local authority had tried everything, but it just wasn't safe because of the son's conduct. The property was seriously dilapidated and cold and dirty, and the judge described it as a death trap. Mr. Myers was in psychological distress at the point that he was found by the local authority and was in a parlous state, according to the judge, which he was. And he was taken to a care home where he agreed to stay for some time while capacity assessments were undertaken in relation to him, established that he had capacity, and as the judge said, his intellect was effervescent. And he then said, I want to go back home and live with my son, whom I've lived with for 35 years, who I have promised my dying wife I would look after, and I don't want to live without him. I know what the risks are in going back to live with him. I know what he's like. He's told me he's given up the drugs. I believe him, but I know what I'm going back into, and I'd rather die than not live with him. So I was acting for the local authority in that case. Mr. Myers was representing himself. He was joining joining by telephone to all the hearings, although he subsequently got pro bono representation. I was saying to the judge, he's got capacity. We don't think there's any constraint or coercion. He's been separated from his son. We don't think the son is preventing him from exercising his capacitous wish. We think you should let him go home, even though the risks are significant. And the judge really didn't want to let him go home because he thought he was going to die having been neglected. So I'm going on to the next slide now. Myers continued. I'm just setting out a bit more of the factual background there. And the court held importantly that Mr. Myers had a real wish to live. He wanted to get to 100. He wanted to receive a telegram from the Queen, rather, and that his wish to live to 100 was inconsistent with his desire to go home where he faced such significant risk. And I'm going on to the next slide there, where I've put a quote from the judgment. KF, who's the son, is needy, irrational, frequently out of control, as well as manifestly emotionally dependent on a father who, despite the alarming history of this case, he obviously loves. And this is the important point. KF's influence on his father is insidious and pervasive. It triggers Mr. Myers' sense of duty, guilt, love, and responsibility. These, in my assessment, are pronounced facets of Mr. Myers' character, reflected in a different way in his sense of duty, love of his country, and pride in his medals. So what's being said there is not that his son is constraining him or unduly influencing him, but it's simply the nature of the relationship between the two of them, codependent, enmeshed, whatever you want to call it, that means that in the judges, in the court's analysis, means that Mr. Myers was disabled from making a truly informed decision. And that extends the case law, because one can see a lot of relationships in which that might arise. That might arise in codependent marital relationships. It might arise in abusive relationships between husband and wife in domestic violence context, and so on. And so it gives rise to the question that local authorities need to be asking themselves is, do we need to be going to court, even though this person has capacity to make decisions, even though when they are separated from the person who is abusing them, they still say, and it sounds sensible, but it doesn't sound sensible, but they still say, and it sounds rational, they want to go back and live with them. And so I've just set out very briefly the consequences of that decision. In that case, the court came to the view that Mr. Myers was disabled from making decisions, even though there was no evidence from any professional that that was their assessment. Social workers had assessed and concluded there was no evidence of vitiation, and there was an assessment from a consultant psychiatrist saying that he had capacity. And I've said, despite the judge acknowledging that Mr. Myers accepted the risks to him of living with his son, said he would rather die than live without him. And really what it seems that the decision comes down to is this, that Mr. Myers was unable or unwilling to weigh his need against those of his sons because of the way he felt about his sons, because of the relationship. His son's needs would always take precedence. So he would always go back and live with him, even though his son had disconnected the boiler, there was taken out the windows, it was a death trap, he wasn't feeding him, he had no bed, and he was in a parlous state. And so who else is caught by this judgment? Should a wider range of vulnerable adults being brought before the court and be effectively have the court make decisions for them on this basis. And that, I think, is a very difficult and tricky issue for local authorities to navigate. So that was the end of my talk. I have just gone over my time, I think. I can't hear you, so if anyone has a question, I've got my phone here if that would work, or maybe we've simply run out of time.